Thank you, Mr. President. This is one of those bills, colleagues, that had John Q. Public and Jane Q. Public had the opportunity to come and debate and have a robust debate about DEI. I don't want to say DEI. I want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I thought about, in discussing diversity and discussing equity and discussing inclusion, if there is a need to ban DEI, then what is the opposite to diversity? Well, the opposite to diversity is uniformity. And to be uniform means that you lack any other options for anyone to be different, to look different, to talk different, to walk different, to be different. Then I thought about, well, what is the opposite of equity? Well, the opposite of equity is inequity. And then I thought about, what is the opposite of inclusion? Well, the opposite of inclusion is exclusion. Now, my colleagues may not quite understand where I'm coming from because you don't know what it's like to be first if you've never been last. And so when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when the architects wrote that promise, there were some folks that could not benefit from that promise. And that's why we have diversity of thought, diversity of personhood, because we did treat some folks like second-class citizens. And when I look at this bill and we talk about educational programs and the post-secondary institution shall promote, support, or maintain any programs or activities that advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it lists a group of definitions. So then I had to do the math because I am a public school graduate, and when I look back on the math, it had only been 61 years since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed. It wasn't until 1971 that the city of Savannah would integrate public schools and have a federal monitor for 20 years because the school district chose to remain segregated for another 20 years. It wasn't until 1996 when the city of Savannah would elect its first African-American mayor because representation had not always been granted. But then I thought about maybe if I just skip back from 1964 and I'm leaving 2025, maybe I would get down to 1865. And in 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman would march, burning every plantation on his way from Atlanta down to Savannah, but he would issue Sherman's Field Order number 15 that said, basically on all 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land, it would be divided by 40 acres for every African American to get 40 acres and a mule. That was equity. Well, we know that President Lincoln was assassinated and that promise was not delivered. So that equity promise never came to for those folks that had been oppressed. And so while we're talking about what is diversity, what is equity, and what is inclusion, colleagues, it is more than just what you see on this sheet of paper right here. It is a fundamental understanding of the folks that have fought, bled, and died, especially in the civil rights movement, to make sure that African Americans could have an equal footing or a place. And so when I read words in the bill that talk about you cannot promulgate policies or promote policies or procedures implemented with reference to race, color, sex, ethnicity, national origin, gender identity, or sexual orientation, colleagues, I wonder what made us so nervous about having folks that were diverse. Because last time I checked, the state of Georgia does not have any anti-discrimination laws on the books. That's why we had to repeal the the citizens arrest law. Because if you think about the tragedy that happened and you watch how the civil justice system unfolds, you can quite find that folks are treated very differently. It's not 100 years or 50 years. You can just look back at last year. You can look back at the amount of folks that just don't like you because of the color of your skin. That's why we have diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if I could prick the moral conscience of every colleague in this room, I would just ask you to think about how many times have you looked to work with a diverse vendor? How many times have you done intentional business with somebody that didn't look like you? How many times have you gone out of your way to go into a community that wasn't your community? How many times have you gone to help folks that didn't look like you? And so then I thought, well, maybe my faith could compel my colleagues, and I was drawn back to a scripture, and I want to share it with you. It was Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse number 30. And Jesus said a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went in and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he went and put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, look after him. He said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd like to come back to the bill because I want to put a bow on it. Line 37 says, any effort to promote, promulgate any training, programming, recruitment, retention, or activities designed or implemented with preferential treatment of any race, color, sex, ethnicity, national origin, gender identity, or sexual orientation over another. Any effort to promote or promulgate any training, programming, or activities designed or implemented with reference to race, color, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And so you're saying it would be illegal to tell folks about what happened to African Americans. It would be illegal to talk about history. It would be illegal to accept the reality of the painful past of folks that may not look like everybody in this room. And so when we talk about anti-racism, or systemic oppression, or social justice, I would remind my colleagues the night before his assassination in April of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King told a group of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, that we have to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point in Memphis. We've got to see it through, because Dr. King believed the struggle in Memphis exposed the need for economic equality and social justice. That's why he wanted to highlight his Poor People's Campaign nationally, because the fight for economic equality and social justice are not just simply diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, my colleagues, I just ask you this question. Have you given yourselves to the struggle to eradicate different identities and people of different thoughts and ideas? Because, again, you don't know what it's like to be first until you've ever been last. In the history of the United States of America, we have only appointed 3 African Americans to the highest court in the United States. Why is that? And so as I continue to move through this bill, just to highlight the further issues with the bill, it just continues to talk about having any program, and you would violate this subsection and we would withhold state funding or state-administered federal funding. Well, we see what happened when DEI rolled out at the federal level. The Tuskegee Airmen were removed from the Department of Defense website. We saw that the first Major General from Vietnam, an African American to receive the Medal of Honor, was removed from the website. We see that Jackie Robinson was removed from the website. We see this over and over and over again, because the opposite of diversity is uniformity. And when the architects of our republic wrote those magnificent words to the Declaration of Independence, folks who looked like me didn't have the opportunity to partake in that promise. So Dr. King said we're all tied together in an inescapable network of mutuality, that whatever I am, you ought to be, and until I can be what I ought to be, you can't be what you ought to be. And so the idea that we would ban diversity, equity, and inclusion is simply nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Because if you truly look at the merits of this bill, what other opportunities do we withhold funding? We never withheld funding from any post-secondary institution if they denied someone entrance based on their race, their ethnicity, their color, creed. We've never withheld that funding. We've never passed any laws or legislation like that. And so now we say, but if you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're going to hold the money back. Well, what about the folks that paved the way? We're going to say that, oh, well, now we can't talk about race. It makes me uncomfortable. Well, that is a dark past of history that we too must accept. You cannot sweep history under the rug. You have to accept the things as though they have happened. But the idea that you would limit the discussion based on this because it makes you uncomfortable, colleagues, I think we're better than this bill. Just because somebody says something don't make it true. Just because somebody said something, I've never understood how DEI can be classified as didn't earn it. And when you talk about things will be based on merit, that is an ideology that the person who makes the determination of what is merit, they get to determine what is merit-worthy. What is the merit? You can still have all the requirements and all the things checked, like many African Americans. They checked the box and they were still denied entrance. They had all the criteria and all the qualifications and they were still denied a license. They had every opportunity to do everything and they were still denied. So it can't be about merit because we already tried that before and merit didn't work for us. We tried merit time and time again and we were still at the bottom of the barrel. So clearly we had to have something to make some equity in this program. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion is just simply that, colleagues. It's an opportunity to bring people in that don't look like you. And if you don't look to see who the folks are that don't look like you and to see where their makeup happens to be, I wouldn't be the senator of the second if it wasn't for the Civil Rights Act. Because my district under Section 2 is majority minority, majority black. The folks that send me to Atlanta happen to be majority black. And they chose to elect a representative. That's why you can't crack and that's why you can't pack. Because if this was truly all equitable, we wouldn't have those laws on the books and folks wouldn't be trying to pack folks in a district or trying to crack folks in another district. But as I close, Mr. President, time and time again, what a tangled web we weave when we seek to deceive. But colleagues, I just want you to know if you vote on this bill, it'll be a referendum on how you view folks that don't look like you, how you don't view folks that may not think like you think, look like how you look. And colleagues, I think that's a slippery sliding slope. Anytime we pass laws like this, because the unintended consequence is just like when we were fighting to make sure that AP African American history would be treated the same way as European AP history. The state school superintendent couldn't even answer the question as to why it wasn't permitted. Had to have folks make phone calls, had to have folks write letters, do all of those things to include AP African American history. Even Governor Kemp himself sent a letter over to the state school superintendent to ask why AP African American history wasn't being treated the same as European history. Why the Attorney General sent a letter, had to ask the same question. So if it was all about diversity, equity, and inclusion, why last year did we have to go through all of that hurdle to ensure that AP African American history would be treated and taught the same as European history? My colleagues, where were you on that? Did you sit silently in your chairs and be duplicitous in the process, or did you say something about it? Because I remember I checked the roll call of people that sent a letter over to the state school superintendent asking a question about why the treatment was different. And so again, I just say, if it was about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we wouldn't be fighting right now to make sure that representation was equal for everybody. But you don't know what it's like to be first until you've ever been last. And if you've never been last, Mr. President, I don't know what to tell you, but I can tell you about some folks that have been last. I can tell you about some folks that have been first. I can tell you about some folks that did some amazing things. And as I take my seat for the last time, Mr. President, I'm reminded of that great sister named Fannie Lou Hamer that said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And Mr. President, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I yield the well. Oh, well, Mr. President, if there are questions. Let me take a few questions because I don't mind.
Recognize the senator from the 28th. Recognize senator from the 14th.
Thank you, Mr. President. As my good friend from the second yield.
I yield.
Senator, do you remember earlier this year when there was a tragic collision of a plane and a helicopter at a D.C. airport? You remember that episode?
I absolutely remember that. The senator from the 14th, I do.
Senator, further yield.
I further yield.
Senator, you remember that several officials in President Trump's administration, I think including the president himself, blamed the crash on DEI. Do you remember that?
I do remember that, Senator.
And Senator, do you yield for a couple more questions about that?
I do. I yield for a series from my good friend from the 14th.
Senator, at the time, was there any evidence of who even the pilots of the helicopter and the plane were when the president made these comments?
There was no evidence based on who the pilot or the co-pilot of either of the aircrafts at the time happened to be, but to make a statement about DEI from the former president was no indication that he actually had any factual basis to make that determination, but it was something that he just decided to spew.
Senator, not that we know the mind of the president directly, but is there any indication of why the president or some of his officials might have immediately blamed DEI or blamed the crash on quote-unquote DEI?
It was to further stoke, in my opinion, Senator, further division in this country, to have folks wondering, well, who were the pilots and what if they were of the D version of DEI and were diverse? And so when those pilots were not diverse, he never retracted the statement to say, oh, it's not DEI, because he didn't know who the pilots were.
Senator, and I want to be very clear, colleagues, that I don't think that everybody who says DEI in a derogatory way means this. But what is the concern that some people have about why people are using the word DEI and what they mean when they say that?
Well, Senator from the 14th, you know also well that when folks use the term now DEI, it is the new N-word to be derogatory, especially of those of African-American, African descent here in this country, and it is furthermore derogatory to say DEI and to classify that by saying didn't earn it. As you know, Senator from the 14th, I hold 3 degrees, and I believe that I'm very much educated, but I got to school on a thank you, Jesus, not cum laude, not magna cum laude, not summa cum laude, but thank you, Lord. And I was just glad that I got out of college, but guess what? It wasn't DEI that got me to college. It was a university by the sea known as the Savannah State University, the state's first historically black college or university in this state, where we started off in Athens, Georgia, and we were moved down to Savannah and given swampland, which happened to be the old placenta plantation. And they told our first president, well, maybe you can make the Georgia Industrial College for Negroes go down here. And he said, and I quote, tell them we are rising.
Thank you, Senator.
Recognize senator from the 41st.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, do you yield?
I do yield.
Senator, I know there's a series of amendments on the table, so you may not have had a chance to look at it, but I want to look at amendment number 2 for a minute, and if you could just give me your opinion as to whether you would understand this to be a friendly amendment. Now, this amendment is from the senator from the 14th, but it says that nothing in this code shall be construed to prohibit a local education agency or post-secondary institution from promoting as an official position that, 1, evolutionary biology is a scientific fact, 2, slavery was the primary or major contributing cause of the American Civil War, or 3, the Holocaust occurred. So in your opinion, dear Senator, would you consider that a friendly amendment for us to attest that we need to include these things when we talk about DEI?
Absolutely. I do believe that is a friendly amendment to my good friend, the senator from the 41st. And the reason I believe that to be a very good amendment, because when we talk about the need for states' rights, the idea that the Civil War would happen was an issue between the North and the South, because the South wanted to promulgate and maintain slavery as a status quo. And so I do believe that that is a scientific fact, that that did in fact happen. And in fact, President Lincoln, when he wrote his second inaugural address to Congress, said that the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. For our case, we must arise. The occasion is piled high with difficulty. For our case is new, we must act anew and think anew. And so as Lincoln was talking about that, his message was to unify the country around the idea that we ought to treat everybody the same. And that's why we have the Emancipation Proclamation. And it wasn't until about June, I believe, 1865, 66, when federal soldiers marched down to Galveston, Texas to free the last few slaves that remained in Galveston, Texas. And that's why we have Juneteenth today. And to also talk about the Holocaust, Senator, is also included because we want to make sure that everyone's history is recorded, taught, and described properly, because when we talk about the anti-version of diversity, that is uniformity. And if you could think about what Jews suffered in the Holocaust, that was about uniformity to ensure their extermination. So therefore, Hitler did not want diversity, he wanted uniformity. That's why DEI is a slippery slope, and why we must caution ourselves before we entangle ourselves on a web that is further eroding.
Senator from the 51st, you have a question? You don't have a question? Okay. I got you, Senator. You're almost there. Recognize Senator from the 9th.
Senator, do you yield?
I do, to my good friend from the 9th.
Isn't it true that we're talking a lot of money, a lot of federal dollars, a lot of state dollars could be, at risk for these schools? Is that not true?
That is true.
So I'm looking at the bill, Senator. Do you see anything in this bill where there's a process that can ensure complaints are evaluated fairly and the schools are going to be allowed to defend themselves? Do you see that anywhere in the bills?
Senator, I do not see that in this bill. What I do see are punitive measures, and I don't see how those punitive measures will be even interpreted, because the measures are simply that state funding will be withheld. And I, Senator, wonder who will be the person to make the determination on the application of such legislation or its enforcement, because I'm too wondering how would that go, or will that just be the thought or idea that DEI is happening and then funds would be withheld, and would that be the power of the General Assembly? Which also brings another question that is unconstitutional, because when the General Assembly appropriates money to the University System of Georgia, we do so in a block grant, Senator, and so that money is then appropriated, and it's up to the University System of Georgia to determine the administration of those dollars that are appropriated by the General Assembly, and we do not have the power to choose what money goes to what institution outside of the capital outlay. And I'm certain that the senator from the 19th would agree with me in terms of that process. So even to talk about the withholding of funding, it is my opinion, Senator, that too would also be considered unconstitutional, because the state constitution says that whatever money we promulgate to the university system, it is up to the system to then administer and distribute out as they see fit.
Senator, do you further yield?
I further yield.
So to be clear, there is nothing in this bill to where an institution could properly defend themselves against this law.
No, and that's my concern, Senator, about the legislation. And so the other concern that I have about the legislation talks about the State Board of Education shall be authorized to withhold for a local education agency. But as you know, we've made it rain on vouchers, and nothing in this bill will prohibit private schools from teaching any curriculum that would be considered anti-DEI. And so you could have very much so a school that chose to be very racist in its nature and to promulgate hate and use state dollars to do that, because we've allowed you to take a voucher and go and do that. And so my colleagues may disagree with that, but I do believe that would be an issue, because if I had a private school and I accepted vouchers and I wanted to teach critical race theory, there was nothing in the law that would prohibit me as a private school to do that. This only applies to public schools.
Recognize Senator from the 44th.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, do you yield?
I yield to my good friend.
Senator, we've been talking some in this debate about merit and the relative merit of people admitted to universities, given certain opportunities, and appointed to certain positions. Now, isn't that true?
That is true.
Right. Now I'm on Education and Youth Committee. You are not, but I know you're familiar with this debate from what's already been going on here on the floor. And accept as the premise of my question that the relative merit of individuals in jobs, not just in universities, is also part of this conversation. I want to ask you, Senator, about your views on the resumes of two of our top officials in the Department of Defense. I'm going to start with our former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles Q. Brown Jr., also known as CQ Brown. I also want to ask you about the current Secretary of Defense. His name is Pete Hegseth. First, Senator, I'm just going to give you a snippet of each of their resumes, and then I really want to get your thoughts on relative merit and DEI. Charles Q. Brown was the 22nd Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. He was a ROTC at Texas Tech. He served in a variety of positions at the squadron and wing levels, including an assignment to the U.S. Air Force Weapons School as an F-16 Fighting Falcon instructor. His notable staff tours include aide-de-camp to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and Director of the Secretary of the Air Force and Chief of Staff Executive Action Group. His joint assignments include 3 assignments to U.S. Central Command as Air Operations Officer, Current Operations Division, Deputy Director, Operations Directorate, and Deputy Commander. He has commanded a fighter squadron, the U.S. Air Force Weapons School, 2 fighter wings, and twice served as a combined Joint Air Component Commander with command tours at U.S. Air Force's Central Command and Pacific Air Forces. General Brown is also a command pilot with more than 3,100 flight hours, primarily in the F-16, including 130 combat tours, and has flown 20 additional fixed and rotary wing aircraft. He deployed or directly supported Operation Southern Watch, Operation Northern Watch, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Odyssey Dawn, Operation Unified Protector, and Operation Inherent Resolve. And I could go on and on. Let's turn, if you'll indulge me, to Pete Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth, and let me just tell you that these are both from the Department of Defense website, same website. He was commissioned as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army National Guard. He participated in a number of active duty deployments, including at Guantanamo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He has authored 5 books, and he has gotten several military awards. Those are the 2 biographies. Senator, can you let me know who you think was qualified to be in charge of our troops who are putting their lives on the line? And give me your thoughts on the relative merit of the people appointed to be cabinet secretaries in the Trump administration.
Well, thank you, Senator. That's a really good question. If it was based actually on merit, as you know, General Brown has a commensurate resume and combat experience that is unparalleled to anyone else. And so to the current Secretary of Defense, he does not have the resume that is compared to General C.Q. Brown, and neither has he reached the rank of general, meaning he did not serve enough time. He did not receive more time and grade or promotions to receive or have a higher rank than General Brown. General Brown absolutely is commensurate with, based on merit, the more qualified candidate based on merit. And for those reasons, that's why, again, merit is determined based on the person who determines what the merit is. There's no rubric or rigorous litmus test as to the determination of what is merit and what is not merit. Merit is decided by the person who is reading the resume and application that makes the determination on who has what merit.
Senator, is it not true that Secretary Hegseth himself insinuated or directly said that C.Q. Brown was a DEI hire?
Absolutely. I did hear that statement. I heard that statement multiple times. And in fact, General C.Q. Brown, as chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and his current replacement, lacks even the rank that General C.Q. Brown. He's a vice general, not even a 4-star general, and he only has intelligence experience and does not even have combat experience, which was required for the job, and therefore would require a waiver to even serve in the position because he didn't have the relevant experience. And so when we talk about merit, again, merit is in the eye of the person determining what is merit and what is not merit, which again further erodes an issue of why you have to have diversity, equity, and inclusion, because as someone who is a member of the minority party and a minority in the minority party, you have to talk about representation and what does that look like when you are a minority and you're not in the majority, and if the majority makes all the decisions and those who are in the majority don't look like anyone else and choose to only put people who look like them into positions, then that's an issue. And if you look at the current administration's cabinet, you only find one African American in the cabinet, and I'm sure there are more African American conservatives that exist. And furthermore, Senator, if the current president would have appointed out of the 3 Supreme Court justices, he could have added another African American if he chose to do so, but that would require the intentionality that is diversity, equity, and inclusion to ensure that the courts are reflective of a country that we all love and live in.
Senator, are you aware of the fact that an individual who was in both Trump administrations posted on social media that you have to have qualified white men running everything?
I am very familiar with that statement, and I did read that statement, and if any of my colleagues did not read that statement, I would be glad to photocopy that, Senator, and place it on their desk, which again is why diversity, equity, and inclusion exists, to ensure that you have a well-represented, thought-out idea, because everyone of diverse backgrounds, ideas, have different opinions, they have different thoughts, they have different lived experiences, and I cannot tell you what my lived experience is versus your lived experience, but I can tell you that you don't know what it's like to be last if you've always been first.
Senator, you were here in the Senate when we passed in 2022 HB 1084, were you not?
I was.
Senator, that you referenced it in your remarks earlier when you discussed the debacle on AP African American Studies.
That is correct.
Senator, why are we, in light of that debacle and the fact that we already passed this law 2 years ago, wasting everyone's time on this exact same topic? What are your thoughts on that? Why are we doing that?
Well, Senator, considering that it is late in the midnight hour and we're bringing this bill up, further erodes public trust, in my opinion, of what the General Assembly is here to do. We've debated a merit of bills. We've debated Brunswick stew. We've debated cornbread. And now we're talking about banning diversity, equity, and inclusion among a chamber that is quite diverse. And so, Senator, it is a great travesty to the state of Georgia and to the American people that we're debating such a measure at such a late night hour, but I'm invigorated by my foremothers and forefathers that I will yield the well, because I may have questions for other senators as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.